Hello, everyone, to this late start. I'm giving a presentation called What We Do When We Do Money. And basically, I have a research project in Darmstadt on blockchain and the future of organizational work, but originally I got started with researching Bitcoin and money, and I figured for this conference I come back to the topic of money, since I always thought it's pretty interesting. There's basically two parts of this talk. First of all, the idea that money is something that's not so much used that it's done, and then an attempt to situate that in a post-crisis world, as in post-financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And first of all, I deal with the idea that money is something that's puzzling. And I always thought that was something that's very fascinating when Bitcoin came up, because there were a lot of things that people thought were odd with Bitcoin or strange, but it seemed to be like nothing that people thought was as offensive as the idea that it could be money. Like that was almost just the idea that someone could just go out and make money seemed almost just offensive to people. And when you actually dig through the literature, there's a lot written on the idea that money is a really, really puzzling entity, something that's really strange and confusing, which is all the more strange because we use it constantly. So like in many ways it's super familiar, and in other ways people try to think about it and then suddenly it's like blocking their minds. And I mean, it's not a purely academic question, but there's also like before the crisis and especially after the crisis, an increasing amount of practical experiments with money that don't just ask this question hypothetically, but also in a very practical way. Like they're like, here's our idea of money, and people start to ask, like, what is that even money? How can someone make money? How can someone create that? And so did Bitcoin and many other cryptocurrencies that followed and went very practically, a very practical challenge to the question of what actually constitutes money. And for this presentation, I want to take a different perspective that maybe resolves some of this puzzlement before I try to place it in a bigger context. And I will shortly explain what this concept of money games means. When we look like in the literature, there's a lot of base definitions. Like it sounds very straightforward, like it's very clear what money is. You get you get a bunch of categories and then you just have to fill it in. But in practical terms, it can often be very confusing nonetheless. When people try to actually apply a definition like that, they become very confused about what is or what is not money. And so I'm kind of trying to take a bit of an alternative approach by not so much focusing on how we use money, but rather focus on the practical side, on how it is we're doing money. And in this sense, I'm suggesting that we can imagine money a bit like a game we play in society. That we don't so much try to ask what really money refers to as a sense of like a commodity or the state or something, but we also don't argue that money is just some random piece of paper that somehow works in society, but rather that it works within the frame of a game, in this case of a money game. So much like the pawn in chess, the pawn does not refer to a person who's out there on the field, and it's not just a meaningless piece of wood, but the role of the pawn is defined by the rules of the game in which it has a function and in which it has a role. So the base question of this talk is like, what kind of game are we playing? Like starting with going back to the very first pictures of the talk, we can already say there's like more mainstream money games and there's more niche money games. Like a mainstream money game like the US dollar or the euro, and there's more niche games like the Chiemgauer, the bricks and pound, and even Bitcoin, which still in many ways is fairly niche. So I kind of will try to puzzle together now what constitutes a money game. So first of all, there's like this aspect of like a history of money, which I will clarify in a moment. There's the basic idea that usually there's a problem of a double coincidence of wants, that if you want to trade one thing for another, you must have what the other one desires and vice versa. So this is an unlikely match. And one idea here is that, for example, Georg Simmel posed that money is some sort of shortcut in this long line of events that gets you to having this object the other one desires. Like you don't have to go all the way up to building your iPhone or something. You just can jump right into the last step and use money as a joker to skip over to that line to get the object you desire. So in terms of the game, there's like universal moves, obviously. Like this idea that you can just use money and do something with it, buy something with it, sell something for money. But then there's also been a growing body of literature that contrasts this history of money with like what could be called a Herstory of Money, where scholars started to point out that money does not work as freely for everyone, but there's also constraints of class, gender, race. That does not, like for Georg Simmel, it was very clear that money is universal because he was also in the position to use it in a universal way. He was like highly educated, white male, somewhere in Germany, and for him, he could just use it as this universal joker, but for his wife and many others, it was not, in many ways, not as universal, but had like all kinds of more particular meanings and constraints. And there's like also like a list of like exemplary monetary practices that also come up, like that also take us away a bit from the idea that there's only buying and selling. But for example, as Gansman argued, buying, lending, borrowing, wasting, hoarding, investing, stealing, and destroying. As Selitzer also argued, there's like gifted money, poor people's money, earmarking of charitable cash. There's like a lot of nuances to money practices. So as Dot argues, there's like a lot of nuances how it connects to other topics like capital, debt, guilt, waste, territory, culture, and the idea of utopias. So to specify this further, there's like not only universal money moves, but also very particular money moves. And there's not just doing the same thing with different monies, but there's also different things we do with the same money. As like doing the same with different monies would be like sometimes you can pay with dollar or euro or Bitcoin or something. Or doing different things with the same money is like when for one person it's a universal joker and for the other one it's very much tied to a particular use. So how do we start playing? Which is like usually seems to be one of the most puzzling question for most people. It's like the idea like if money is used everywhere in society, it makes a lot of sense to just use it, but it like kind of becomes puzzling, the question of how we start with it. And like there's also a lot of questions given that, answers given that try to explain it otherwise by like some rare commodity or the likes, but in this case, I kind of want to focus on what I would think of as the didactics of money. That if we actually look closely how we become avid money users, it explains a lot of the puzzlement that we feel when we look at money. Like first of all, almost everybody uses money almost every day. It's a very, very common practice. We do it a lot and we get trained into it from a very early stage of our life going forward. The second point is we never start from nothing. Everybody who learned to use money learned it from someone else who already has acquired some money competencies, you could say. And the last point is that often when we, later in life, try to ask ourselves why we use money or why money has value, we feel like at some points we were given good reasons to get started with money. But if we look at how we learn money, we find that actually it never started from doubts. Like a 2-year-old is not confused about why money has value or why it should have value, and a parent will not come up and tell this 2-year-old that it has value because the state backs it or because the law backs it or the US Army backs it. It's developing as a natural practice, and we much later we only start to doubt this practice. And this feels very odd because it feels like we had very good reasons to get there and we just have to find them again. But the truth is we never started from doubt. So this is kind of the next point. Like there's like what really gets us going with money is this taken for grantedness, much more than it is a doubt we have overcome at the start. And like sometimes you can also see that like almost empirical. Like there was like a study conducted in Austria where they asked people questions about money, and they find that people have very, very little formal knowledge about money, but they are very competent money users. There's like their use of money for them is not grounded in like knowing some formal aspects of money. It's grounded they're like in some sort almost money literate. They have like a broad sense of how to use money. They just cannot answer a handful of questions that are deemed formally correct. And in that sense, you can also like apply this concept of like a money game to Bitcoin and look at like how Bitcoin is actually done. When you move away from just looking at price charts and look a bit more like what the social practices there that are developing. And this is like, it's one of a very old piece I never quite finished, so that it's just more to illustrate the point that you actually could just, one idea I had back then was that I could just go through articles and look at what practices are actually starting to be connected with this Bitcoin money game. And what you then would find is that like, that there was never quite a point where you could do nothing with Bitcoin. And there's also an ongoing development on like how these practices change or develop. Like you look at the first moment and you find stuff like people could mine, they could tinker with it, they could hoard it. There was some opportunity, like there was donating before there was buying and selling in some senses. There was, you could demand ransom, you could send it, you could receive it, and then you look at the next point in time and there's new functions coming to that, changing how this money game is played. You can deposit, withdraw on exchanges, you can buy or sell drugs. I mean, it was very specific. Buying on Silk Road was a specific move of this Bitcoin money game. You could gamble, you could buy or sell it for fiat. And then you look at the next time and you find different things. You can suddenly buy or sell some physical goods like an overstock. Or this like I think that was like 2015 or so, like basically what this is referring to. Or like there was also a use in signaling. You could use Bitcoin to generate media interest. And many companies would just accept Bitcoin not because anyone was buying anything with it, but because it got some media coverage that they could not get otherwise. And when you go on, you can also look like for the odd cases of money games. When you find, for example, the Iraqi Swiss dinar, which was printed in the UK, and then in the first Gulf War, sanction cut the access to this. But what happened was that Iraq printed some own money of poor quality, often forged. And the Swiss dinar, without having this backing of the state and while being legally prohibited, continued to circulate. So there was a running money game and it continued despite the foundation suddenly falling apart, much like in Somalia, where there was like a situation where central bank and the national government went under, but the official money continued to circulate. Which already takes me to the point of how this all fits in a post-crisis world. Which is basically point to two aspects, and this brings me to two aspects of the financial crisis that I think are very interesting. The first one is what's called the law of finance paradox by Katharina Pistor, who argued that in our society it is necessary that we believe the law is binding, but when crisis strikes, enforcing all contracts can collapse the whole system. And that's why it is, why it is like we need this fictionality of law being binding, but if we enforce all contracts at all times, we collapse the system. So that was basically what happened in the financial crisis. You suspend the law at the apex of power to maintain the system. And I think to some degree it has already been repeated in the blockchain space when, for example, the DAO collapsed and people were willing to suspend the seemingly binding blockchain to save what they believed was, to do what they believed was saving the system. And I mean, the next aspect is the idea of what Mirovsky very insightful calls the working fiction of monetary invariance. This is the idea that for capitalism to work, we need something that we believe to be the stable anchor of value, because we denominate our contracts in future payments. So that so for me to denominate these contracts in future amounts of money, I need to at least suspend the idea that this money value can also fluctuate. And at this moment when like suddenly this became very unclear and this idea that there's one stable anchor in which we can plan was challenged, these 2 points come together and they like create a real sense of loss and insecurity. And from very clearly Bitcoin and many other blockchain projects have been responding to this twofold crisis, like this collapse of the future horizon. On the other hand, like the insight that the law was bent at times of crisis, which also like points us to the other idea. Like what it was very early was a lot of question of like is Bitcoin good money, or as other cryptocurrencies, are they good money? And in this sense, maybe the question was posed a bit wrong, but rather we can look at it like competing money games, which are where the question is not so much is it good money, is it really good money, is it okay money, but rather good money is in some sense just bad money amongst worse monies. And it can we very rarely have a situation, or maybe almost never, where a society which uses money goes back to not using money. Which brings me already to my last point. It's like the other aspect that this post-crisis world has shown for me, and that's where like we have some overlap between like initial coin offerings, Libra, but also like newish monetary theories, is a different approach to valuation. That we have like this free concepts that are describe very different things, the ICOs, the Libra, and the modern monetary theory, but they come together in this insight that they are not so much try to grab the means of production, but they directly go to the idea that they can create value. They all touch on this idea of immediately and directly creating value. That is, as much like for example, in Libra, there's certainly many other reasons for doing that, and there's certainly many other reasons for monetary theory, but they all have this idea of directly creating money on value to become able to act in this world. And here I kind of try to loosely, like the last thoughts are a bit more experimental, but I try to loosely tie that together in the conclusion that there's like this idea of like when we think about what we are doing, when we are doing money, we can think about it in terms of like different money games we play in a society, which are sometimes complementary, sometimes competing, which sometimes allow us to do different moves than between one game and another. And ultimately, both like the original idea of creating money in this way, but also like these later aspects of ICO, of Libra, of modern monetary theory point us to this question on how we can become able to act in this world. And all these projects kind of try to answer it through the creation of money. And this is the end.
Yeah. Okay, so that's really wide-ranging. Thanks. Nice way to kind of conclude this day. I wonder then, is money then a fundamentally capitalist experience, right? Because all the examples that you're highlighting are leading us towards a capitalist game, essentially, right? Is there a way to have non-capitalist relationships with money? And maybe here, as also a suggestion, might be to look into there's a lot of anthropological research on tokens or different objects being used as forms of money, but in less fundamentally capitalist relationships, right?
Yeah.
So maybe that might expand your discussion even further than it already is.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, very obviously, I would say there have been other money games. You had money games in Soviet Russia, and you had money games in history. So I don't know. I guess money was not invented with capitalism. There has been other forms of money before, and they have different functions and different freedoms. So I would say there can be non-capitalist money games.
Cool. That might just be a response to your last question, what do we do? What can we do with money? And so there's this expansion of limits, right? Beyond just what we're kind of taught or brought up to do with money, right?
Yeah.
And that's what some of the experiments are trying to lead us towards, are also non-capitalist forms of exchange, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway.
Sure.
Another wide thought for the end of the day.
Thanks.
Kind of leading on from that point. So it's I mean, it's clear, and the point you make, I think, is really good in the sense that this isn't these types of games, or using the word games is a really good way of framing it, because this isn't a particularly new way of doing things, right? It isn't a particularly new way of how we manage transactions. What is different about our current status is that it's within either a central bank or a government-backed system.
Yeah.
And this, Bitcoin, blockchain, and these cryptocurrencies are effectively either reversing or evolving that trend, right? So I suppose, my question is, in the grandest scheme of games, of how we interact, is this necessarily something that different, or is it just another example of how the system is evolving, do you think?
Yeah, thanks. I don't know, if I have the feeling, if you go back in history and even 18th century or so, 19th century, you already have a much bigger diversity of money. This unified Westphalian nation-state money is not as recent. It's more recent than it feels. So, in terms of that, I think money was more diverse. Then it got very unified in some very, very, hegemonic forms of money, very strong forms of money. And now it's again a bit up for the challenge. And we right now try to figure out where it takes us. What that said.
But if you look back at what happened in the, pre-19th century days, and you have lots of different types of currency, different types of value, and so on, which on a local level seem to have been accepted everywhere. So you had, countries like Germany and Italy are just quite new states. They were divided in sub-states previously, and every region seems to have had their own money.
Yeah.
So it means that you have this, it's again quite decentralized.
Yeah.
And on a local level seems to be accepted, which today we have lots of cryptocurrencies, lots of altcoins, which is to step back to what we had previously.
Yeah.
Seem to have worked. So, yeah. Doesn't seem to be something. I find it rather interesting that these different parts of the world, these very small states, have these, like Brixton. I'm going to have my own money.
Yeah.
I'm not sure to what extent it does work in Brixton, but on a local level in the 18th, 17th century seems to have worked. And I could imagine that different, in parts of Europe you had professions that I believe had their own value of exchange, that in certain professions they had their own way of exchanging value, which again is their own altcoin, their own currency in that. So we seem to have gone from a state where these different currencies have worked to a very centralized one, and now we are going back.
Well,
that makes sense.
Yeah, the question is how far we are going back. It certainly gets more fractured right now, and from another direction, there's new attempts of unifying it through powerful platforms, some banking networks, some nations. And the US dollar still is powerful, that's without a doubt. Or maybe the yuan is rising further. So if it got a bit fractured because what held it together seemingly got damaged in some ways, but I'm not sure if it means we go back to a more decentralized, more fractured money game landscape, so to say, or if then comes a new wave of unifying it. Because to this date, there's no real alternative to the US financial system in this world for most activities. There's no parallel structure to that. So I guess we have to see where it takes us, if that makes sense. Well, thanks everyone for attending.